On the morning of March 14, 1979, a civilian communications technician named Robert Marsh was eating a tuna sandwich in the basement of a government building in Raleigh, North Carolina, when he heard something that would unravel one of the most elaborate Soviet intelligence networks operating on American soil. The sound came from a radio he wasn't supposed to be fixing, transmitted on a frequency that shouldn't have existed, carrying a message that would cost 3 people their lives and force the entire Eastern Seaboard SIGINT apparatus to be restructured. This is the story of how ordinary incompetence led to extraordinary discovery, and how a man who simply wanted to finish his shift on time became the accidental architect of an intelligence operation that reached from a forgotten storage room in North Carolina all the way to a dacha outside Moscow, where decisions about American nuclear capabilities were being made based on information gathered from a transmitter hidden inside what locals believed was an abandoned textile warehouse. The radio itself was unremarkable, a Motorola HT220 standard issue for municipal services, purchased through regular government procurement channels in 1974. It had been sitting in a cardboard box marked "Repair Backlog Low Priority" for 11 months. Nobody cared about it. Nobody remembered who had requisitioned the repair. The work order, typed on a form that predated the Carter administration, simply stated intermittent static, possible crystal fault. Marsh had pulled it from the pile only because he had finished his assigned work early, and his supervisor, a man named Kenneth Drury, who had worked for the General Services Administration for 23 years without a single notable achievement, had told him to look busy, because a senator's aide was touring the facility that afternoon, and empty hands looked like wasted taxpayer money. Marsh was not an intelligence analyst. He was not a trained investigator. He had no security clearance beyond what was required to access the communications equipment he maintained. He had attended a technical school in Virginia, served 4 unremarkable years in the Army Signal Corps without ever leaving the continental United States, and accepted this civil service position because it paid $11,000 a year and included dental insurance his wife needed for the braces their daughter wore. He bowled on Thursdays. He drove a 1976 Chevrolet Impala that needed new brake pads. He had voted for Ford, then Carter, without strong feelings either way. He was, in every measurable way, the kind of person intelligence services prefer to ignore because surveillance resources are finite, and Robert Marsh appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be. The basement where he worked smelled like transformer oil and old paint. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, 2 of them flickering in a pattern that had been irritating him for 6 months. The space had been designed during the Eisenhower administration as a civil defense shelter, then repurposed in the 1960s as storage, then again in the 1970s as a workshop for equipment maintenance, when budget cuts made it impractical to contract repairs to private vendors. The walls were cinder block, painted institutional green. A coffee maker sat on a filing cabinet, perpetually brewing a substance that tasted like what Marsh imagined dissolved asbestos might taste like. A calendar from a hydraulic supply company hung on the wall, still showing February even though it was mid-March. Someone had circled the date of Elvis Presley's death, though Marsh had no idea who or why. He had been working on the Motorola for approximately 40 minutes when the interference began. At first he assumed the problem was his test equipment. The signal generator he was using had been manufactured in 1968 and had a tendency to drift if the room temperature varied by more than a few degrees. He adjusted the calibration, checked his connections, swapped out the patch cable he was using. The interference persisted. It was not random static. It had structure, rhythm. He recognized immediately that it was not a natural phenomenon, not atmospheric conditions or solar activity, or any of the predictable sources of radio noise that every technician learned to identify. Someone was transmitting. The frequency was 167.4375 MHz, which fell within a band allocated to federal government use, but was not, according to the channel assignment sheet taped to his workbench, assigned to any agency operating in the Research Triangle region. Marsh did what any competent technician would do. He checked to see if he had made a mistake. He verified the frequency 3 times using 2 different pieces of equipment. He consulted the allocation tables. He walked upstairs to the office where frequency assignments were maintained and asked the clerk, a woman named Patricia, who was planning her retirement party even though it was still 8 months away, if there had been any recent changes to the local spectrum management plan. She told him there had not been. She told him that 167.4375 had been listed as unassigned since 1976, when the Forest Service had switched to a different band. She asked him why he wanted to know. He told her he was just checking something. She went back to addressing envelopes for her party invitations. He returned to the basement. The signal was still there. Stronger now, or perhaps he was simply paying closer attention. He connected the Motorola to an external antenna, a simple dipole he had constructed from coat hangers and coaxial cable for exactly this kind of diagnostic work. The interference resolved into something that was definitely a transmission, not voice, not continuous tone, a pattern of bursts, short-long, short-short-long. It resembled Morse code, but the timing was irregular. He recorded 3 minutes of it onto a cassette tape using a portable recorder he kept in his toolbox for documenting equipment faults. He labeled the cassette with the date and frequency and set it on his workbench next to the dismantled Motorola. For approximately 10 minutes he considered doing nothing. The transmission was not his problem. His job was to repair radios, not investigate unexplained signals. He had no authority to pursue the matter. He had no particular curiosity about signals intelligence or radio surveillance. He wanted to finish the repair, complete his paperwork, and leave at 5 o'clock so he could stop at the grocery store on the way home because his wife had asked him to buy milk and hamburger. Meat, and he had forgotten twice already that week. But the transmission bothered him in a way he found difficult to articulate. It was not that it was mysterious. It was that it was deliberate. Someone had gone to considerable effort to transmit on a frequency that was not supposed to be in use, at a power level low enough that it would not trigger interference complaints from legitimate users. Using a pattern that was clearly information but not in any format he recognized. It suggested planning, resources, intent. He made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life in ways he could not have anticipated. He decided to find the source of the transmission. Not because he suspected espionage, not because he had any particular sense of patriotic duty, but because the technical challenge interested him in a way that repairing the endless succession of broken radios and malfunctioning dispatch consoles did not. He wanted to know who was transmitting and why they had chosen that specific frequency. It was, he would later tell investigators, the same impulse that made him take apart mechanical watches when he was a child. He wanted to see how it worked. Direction finding in 1979 was not the sophisticated digital process it would become in later decades. It required patience, physical movement, and equipment that was rarely calibrated properly. Marsh had access to a portable direction finder that had been purchased for tracking down sources of interference to FAA communications. It was a Doppler-based system, heavy and imprecise, but functional. He signed it out of the equipment inventory using a form that required him to specify the purpose of the loan. He wrote interference investigation, which was technically accurate and sufficiently vague that nobody would ask questions. He loaded the equipment into the back of a GSA station wagon that was used for field maintenance calls. He did not tell his supervisor where he was going. Drury was in a meeting about printer paper allocation and would not notice Marsh's absence unless it extended past the end of the shift. The signal was coming from somewhere to the east. That was the limit of what he could determine from inside the building. Radio waves do not travel in straight lines through urban environments. They reflect off buildings, diffract around obstacles, scatter through the ionosphere in ways that make precise location difficult without multiple measurement points. He drove east on Hillsborough Street, stopping every few blocks to take readings. The signal strength increased as he approached the old warehousing district near the railroad tracks. This was an area of Raleigh that had been prosperous during the textile boom of the 1950s, but had declined as manufacturing moved south to take advantage of cheaper labor and newer facilities. The buildings here were brick, built to last, but largely abandoned. A few had been converted to artist studios or used by small fabrication shops that could not afford space in newer industrial parks. Most were simply empty, waiting for demolition or development that never seemed to arrive. He parked the station wagon on a street that had no name on his map, only a designation that suggested it had been platted during the original city survey, but never formally incorporated into the street grid. The signal was strongest near a 3-story brick structure that had once housed a printing company. He knew this because a faded sign still visible on the north wall advertised "Quality commercial printing, estimates free." The windows on the first floor had been boarded over with plywood that had weathered to the color of old bone. The upper windows were broken, some covered with plastic sheeting that flapped in the wind. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, padlocked at the gate, but the fence had been cut in several places and crudely repaired with wire. There was no indication that anyone had entered the building recently. No tire tracks in the gravel lot. No trash or evidence of vandalism that would suggest teenage intrusion. Marsh sat in the station wagon for 20 minutes, watching the building and recording signal strength measurements in a notebook he kept for equipment maintenance logs. The transmission continued in its regular pattern. Every 47 seconds, a burst lasting approximately 3 seconds, then silence, then another burst. He calculated that at this rate a complete cycle repeated every 12 minutes and 13 seconds. The precision suggested automation. A timer. A mechanical system that required no human operator to sit and manually trigger each transmission. This was significant. It meant the transmitter could operate for extended periods without supervision. It meant someone had engineered a solution to a specific operational requirement. He considered calling the FCC. Their field office in Atlanta handled interference complaints and had enforcement authority. But he had no evidence that the transmission violated any regulation. The frequency was allocated to government use. For all he knew, some federal agency was conducting a legitimate operation and had simply failed to update the local coordination database. He considered calling the police, but what would he report? A radio signal from an empty building? They would ask him if he had witnessed a crime. He would have to admit he had not. They would tell him to contact the property owner, who, according to county records, was a holding company in Delaware that had not paid property taxes in 4 years. He got out of the station wagon. The afternoon was cool, overcast. The kind of March day where winter had not quite relinquished its hold, but spring was asserting itself in the green shoots pushing through the soil in the vacant lot across the street. He walked to the fence, found one of the spots where it had been cut, and squeezed through. His shirt caught on the wire and tore slightly at the shoulder. He would need to explain that to his wife. He approached the building carefully, looking for signs of occupancy. The main entrance was secured with a padlock that looked newer than the door it was attached to. He walked around to the side of the building where a metal door, painted red but now mostly rust, stood slightly ajar. Someone had forced it open at some point, bending the frame enough that it could no longer close properly. He pushed it wider and stepped inside. The interior smelled like pigeon droppings and rotting paper. Light came through the broken windows in shafts thick with dust. The floor was concrete, stained with oil, and littered with debris. Old machinery, too heavy to move, sat rusting where it had been abandoned. He recognized a printing press, a massive iron structure that must have weighed several tons. Spools of wire, wooden pallets, a desk with drawers that had been pulled out and dumped on the floor. He moved carefully, listening for sounds of occupancy, but heard nothing except the wind through the broken windows and the occasional flutter of wings from pigeons roosting in the rafters. The signal was stronger inside. His direction finder indicated the source was above him. He found a stairwell at the rear of the building. The stairs were metal, open riser design, and they rang hollow under his feet. He climbed slowly, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The second floor was more of the same. Empty rooms, broken furniture. The third floor was different. The door at the top of the stairs was closed and secured with a padlock that was definitely new, brass, a master lock with a shrouded shackle design that suggested someone had given thought to preventing it from being cut icily. Someone had been here recently. Someone who wanted to keep people out. Marsh stood in the stairwell for a long time, looking at that padlock and thinking about what it meant. The transmission was coming from behind that door. Someone had installed a transmitter in an abandoned building, secured it against intrusion, and set it to broadcast on a frequency that was not assigned to any legitimate user. The operational pattern suggested this was not a prank or the hobby project of some radio enthusiast. This was deliberate, professional. He thought about walking away, going back to his office, filing a report with the FCC, letting someone else handle whatever this was. But he had come this far. The technical part of his mind wanted to see the equipment, to understand how someone had built a system that could operate unattended in an abandoned building, without power from the municipal grid. He descended the stairs and searched the first floor until he found what he was looking for in a maintenance closet near the loading dock. Bolt cutters. Old, the handles wrapped in electrical tape where the rubber grips had disintegrated, but functional. Someone had left them behind when the building was abandoned, probably because they were heavy and worn and not worth the effort of carrying out. He returned to the third floor and cut the padlock. The shackle parted with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty building. He waited, listening for any response, any indication that someone had heard. Nothing. He pushed the door open. The room had been an office once, a manager's space probably, with windows overlooking the street and what would have been a view of the loading area below. The windows were intact here, covered from the inside with black plastic sheeting held in place with duct tape. Someone had swept the floor. The debris and pigeon waste that characterized the rest of the building were absent. Against the far wall stood a metal equipment rack, the kind used in telephone exchanges or radio stations. It held 3 units. The top unit was a power supply connected to 2 large automotive batteries wired in parallel. The middle unit was a transmitter, commercial grade, modified extensively with additional circuitry that Marsh recognized as frequency synthesis components. The bottom unit was a timer and control system built from what appeared to be modified industrial process controllers. Next to the rack sat a metal filing cabinet. Next to that, a small table holding a typewriter, a stack of paper, and a cardboard box containing what looked like maintenance supplies. Someone had been here regularly. Recently, the equipment was clean, free of dust. The batteries were charged. A voltmeter attached to the power supply showed 13.2 volts, indicating they had been serviced within the past few days. On the table, next to the typewriter, was a spiral notebook filled with handwritten entries. Dates, times, voltage readings, signal strength measurements. The most recent entry was from 2 days ago, March 12, 1979. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. Each entry followed the same format. Date, time, system status. Any anomalies? The writer had noted a slight voltage drop on March 9th and had replaced one of the battery cells. The entry concluded with system nominal. Marsh photographed everything using a camera he kept in the station wagon for documenting equipment installations. He used an entire roll of film. The equipment, the notebook, the batteries, the connections. He was careful not to touch anything more than necessary. He did not turn off the transmitter. He did not disturb the filing cabinet or the box of supplies. He wanted a record of how things were before anyone knew they had been discovered. When he finished photographing, he examined the transmitter more closely. The modifications were sophisticated. Whoever had built this understood radio frequency engineering at a level that suggested formal training. Military training, possibly. The frequency synthesis circuit used components that were not available through civilian suppliers. They were the kind of parts you found in military communications equipment or in systems designed for government contractors who held security clearances. The transmission pattern made sense now. The timer triggered the transmitter at precise intervals. The message being sent was recorded on a loop of magnetic tape, the kind used in answering machines. The tape loop was housed in a modified cassette mechanism that had been rebuilt for continuous operation. He could see where someone had replaced the standard rubber drive belt with a reinforced version and had added additional tape guides to prevent the loop from jamming. This was engineered to run for months without maintenance. The only regular requirement would be battery service and occasional checks to ensure the tape loop had not degraded. He opened the filing cabinet. Inside were additional tape loops, each labeled with dates and numbers. January 1979. December 1978. November 1978. The sequence extended back to June 1977, 21 months of recorded messages. He removed the tape loop currently in the transmitter and replaced it with one from the filing cabinet, labeled February 1979. The transmission pattern changed. Different burst lengths, different timing intervals. Each tape contained a unique message. Someone was updating the transmission regularly, replacing old tapes with new ones, ensuring that whatever information was being sent remained current. In the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, he found something that transformed his understanding of what he had discovered. A logbook. Not the maintenance notebook on the table, but a separate record, bound in black leather, containing columns of numbers and what he recognized as cipher groups. Each entry was dated. Each entry contained a sequence of 5-digit groups, typically between 40 and 60 groups per entry. Next to each date was a notation in what appeared to be Russian. He did not read Russian, but he recognized the Cyrillic alphabet from his army training. The entries extended back to 1976. Over 3 years of transmissions recorded meticulously, archived systematically. He photographed the logbook page by page. 37 pages of cipher groups in Russian notations. When he finished, he replaced everything exactly as he had found it, returned the current tape loop to the transmitter, and left the room. He did not replace the padlock. There was no point. It had been cut, and whoever serviced this equipment would notice immediately that someone had been there. He walked back to the station wagon, loaded his equipment, and drove to a payphone at a gas station 3 blocks away. He did not return to his office. He called a number he had been given during his army service, a number he had been told to use only if he ever encountered something that might be relevant to national security. He had never expected to use it. He was not even certain it was still valid after 6 years. The number rang 4 times before someone answered. A woman's voice, neutral, professional, federal operator. "How may I direct your call?" He explained who he was and what he had found. Not in detail. Just enough to convey that he was a government employee who had discovered what he believed might be an unauthorized radio transmitter operating on a federal frequency. The operator asked him to hold. 2 minutes passed. A different voice came on the line. Male. Older. "This is Agent Cunningham, FBI. You need to tell me exactly what you found and where you are right now," Marsh told him. The location, the equipment, the logbook with Russian notations. Cunningham did not interrupt. When Marsh finished, there was silence on the line for several seconds. Then Cunningham said, "I need you to go back to that building and wait for us. Don't let anyone enter that room. Don't touch anything else. We're sending people now. How long will it take you to get back there?" 5 minutes. Go now. We'll have agents there in 20 minutes. If anyone shows up before we arrive, you need to keep them out of that room. Do you understand? What if they're armed? Then you let them go and you stay out of their way. But you need to be there so you can show us exactly what you found. This is important. Do you understand? Marsh understood. He drove back to the building and parked where he could watch the entrance. He felt ridiculous sitting in a government station wagon playing watchman over an abandoned warehouse, but he did what Cunningham had told him to do. 15 minutes passed. A blue sedan pulled up to the fence. 2 men got out, both wearing suits despite the casual Wednesday afternoon. They saw Marsh, walked over to the station wagon. The older one showed credentials, FBI. Special Agent David Cunningham and Special Agent Robert Torres. Cunningham was perhaps 50, gray hair cut short, the kind of face that suggested he had spent his career interviewing people who lied to him. Torres was younger, maybe 30, with the careful movements of someone trained to expect threats. Marsh led them into the building and up to the third floor. Neither agent spoke during the climb. When they reached the room with a cut padlock, Cunningham examined it briefly, then pushed the door open. Both agents stopped just inside the doorway, looking at the equipment rack and the filing cabinet. Torres said, "Jesus Christ." Cunningham said nothing for several seconds, then turned to Marsh. "You didn't touch the transmitter?" "Only to swap the tape loop to see if the transmission pattern changed. I put it back the way I found it." "Show me the logbook." Marsh opened the filing cabinet and removed the black leather book. Cunningham flipped through it, his expression unchanging, then handed it to Torres. "Get on the radio. Tell Jacobs we need a full technical team here immediately. Tell him we have a number station with 3 years of logs and active transmission capability. Tell him we need surveillance on this building starting now, and we need to know who owns this property and every person who has accessed it in the past year." Torres left to make the call. Cunningham walked around the room slowly, looking at everything but touching nothing. He stopped in front of the equipment rack, studying the modified transmitter. "You have a technical background?" "Army Signal Corps. Now I maintain communications equipment for GSA. What made you track down this signal?" "Curiosity. I was repairing a radio and picked up interference. I wanted to know what was causing it." Cunningham looked at him with an expression that might have been amusement or might have been pity. "You could have ignored it, filed a complaint with the FCC, gone home at 5 o'clock like you were supposed to." "I could have. Why didn't you?" Marsh thought about that. About the tuna sandwich he had been eating when he first heard the interference. About the broken Motorola that had sat in a cardboard box for 11 months because nobody cared enough to prioritize its repair. About the small, ordinary decisions that had brought him to this room where someone had spent 3 years transmitting encrypted messages to Moscow from a building nobody cared about in a city that had no strategic significance except that it was there, unremarkable, forgotten. "I wanted to know how it worked," he said. Torres returned. "Team is en route. ETA 40 minutes. Jacobs wants us to secure the site and maintain visual surveillance until they arrive. He's pulling the case file on Soviet number stations operating in the southeast. He said to tell you this is the first one we've found with the equipment still active. More agents arrived. Then technicians from the National Security Agency carrying equipment in cases stenciled with classifications that Marsh did not have clearance to read. The building that had been empty for years was suddenly full of people speaking in acronyms and wearing credentials from agencies Marsh had heard of but never interacted with. Someone set up a perimeter. Someone else began photographing the room using cameras far more sophisticated than Marsh's Kodak Instamatic. A woman in her 30s, introduced only as Dr. Chun from Fort Meade, began examining the transmitter with instruments that measured electromagnetic emissions at levels Marsh had never considered relevant. Cunningham pulled him aside. "We're going to need you to write a detailed statement about everything you did from the moment you first detected the interference until you called the FBI. Everything you touched, everyone you spoke to, every decision you made. We need to establish a chain of custody for evidence, and we need to know if anyone else might be aware of what you found. I didn't tell anyone, except the federal operator and you. You're sure? You didn't mention it to your supervisor? Your wife? Anyone at the office?" "No one." "Good. We need to keep it that way. As of this moment, everything related to this investigation is classified. You can't discuss it with anyone. Not your supervisor, not your wife, not anyone." "Do you understand?" Marsh nodded. He understood that his ordinary Wednesday afternoon had ended and something else had begun. Something that operated according to rules he did not know in a world that existed parallel to the one where he repaired radios and bought groceries and forgot to replace the brake pads on his Chevrolet. Dr. Chun called Cunningham over to the equipment rack. Marsh watched as she pointed to something on the transmitter, explaining in technical language that even he had difficulty following. Cunningham listened, asked questions, then turned to Torres. "Get on the phone with Jacobs again. Tell him Chun says the frequency synthesis circuit uses components from the NGRC 106 system, military only, no civilian applications. Tell him whoever built this had access to classified military communications equipment manufactured between 1973 and 1976. The room became quieter as that information registered. Someone with military access. Someone who understood classified communications systems. Someone who had been operating undetected for at least 3 years in a building that nobody paid attention to in a city that had no significant military presence. The implications were obvious even to Marsh. This was not some amateur enthusiast. This was professional espionage conducted with resources and expertise that suggested state sponsorship. Night fell. Floodlights were set up around the building. More agents arrived. Marsh was moved to a temporary command post established in a van parked in the gravel lot. He spent 4 hours writing his statement, interrupted periodically by agents who asked him to clarify specific details. What time had he first detected the interference? What was the exact frequency? Had he noticed any vehicles near the building? Had he seen any evidence of recent entry? He answered everything as precisely as he could, aware that each detail might be significant in ways he could not anticipate. At 11 o'clock, Cunningham released him. Go home. Report to work tomorrow like normal. Don't discuss this with anyone. Someone will contact you within 48 hours to schedule a more detailed debriefing. You'll probably need to testify if this goes to trial, but that's months away. For now, just maintain your normal routine. Marsh drove home. His wife was asleep. His daughter was asleep. The house was dark except for the porch light his wife always left on when he worked late. He stood in the kitchen drinking a glass of water, looking at the refrigerator covered with his daughter's artwork in school. Notices and a shopping list his wife had written in her careful handwriting. Milk, hamburger, laundry soap. The ordinary catalog of an ordinary life. He had forgotten to stop at the grocery store. Again, he would have to explain that tomorrow. He would have to lie about why he was late. He would have to pretend that nothing had changed when in fact everything had changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. The investigation that followed consumed resources from multiple agencies over the course of 14 months. The building was placed under 24-hour surveillance. The property records were traced through 3 shell companies back to a corporation registered in Panama that existed only on paper. The batteries were analyzed for fingerprints. 43 distinct prints were found, but only 7 could be matched to individuals in federal databases. Of those 7, 3 were deceased, 2 had alibis that eliminated them as suspects, and 2 could not be located. The tape loops were sent to NSA cryptologists who spent 8 months attempting to decrypt the cipher groups. They failed. The encryption system was unknown, possibly one-time pad, theoretically unbreakable without the key. The surveillance produced results on June 3, 1979. A man entered the building at 11:47 p.m. carrying a backpack and a toolbox. He was photographed from 3 angles using infrared cameras. He remained in the building for 36 minutes. When he emerged, agents moved in for arrest. He ran 3 blocks through the warehouse district before Torres caught him in an alley behind a building that had once manufactured textile dyes. The man was carrying 2 fresh battery cells and a new tape loop dated May 1979. In his wallet was a Maryland driver's license, identifying him as Thomas Brennan, age 41, residing in College Park. The license was genuine. Thomas Brennan existed. He worked as a systems analyst for a defense contractor that held contracts with the National Security Agency. He had a wife, 2 children, and a security clearance that gave him access to classified communications infrastructure. Brennan refused to speak without an attorney. He was held under provisions of the Espionage Act while investigators obtained warrants, and began dismantling his life to find the connections that would explain how a systems analyst in Maryland had been operating in numbers. Stationed in North Carolina for at least 3 years, they found the connections. A second apartment in Raleigh registered under a false name. Bank accounts in the Cayman Islands containing deposits totaling $237,000. Coded correspondence hidden in a locked drawer in his home office. Photographs of classified documents. a radio receiver tuned to frequencies used by Soviet diplomatic channels, and most damning, a one-time pad that matched the cipher groups in the logbook found at the warehouse.